Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Relationships have the power to wound us and the power to heal us. As a clinical psychologist, author, and professor at Northwestern University, I've devoted my life to studying intimate partnerships and family dynamics. On Reimagining Love, I'm here to translate complex clinical topics into tools and takeaways that you can use in your relationships today. If you're ready to develop relational self-awareness and create vibrant and loving relationships with the people who matter most to you, you've come to the right place. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome back to Reimagining Love. June 24th marks the 2-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. And despite pushback and some pretty incredible advocacy work in the wake of this unprecedented decision, states continue to refine their laws, and pregnant people across the country continue to face fear and roadblocks as they attempt to access reproductive health care. Because we are a show that is devoted to relationships and to helping people cultivate relationships that are founded in empowerment and care, I wanted to shine a light on the pervasive and pernicious impacts of the Supreme Court's decision, the impact on individuals, on couples, and on families in the U.S. When abortion access is restricted or rendered impossible, women suffer, couples suffer, and families suffer in terms of their physical health, their mental health, and their relational health. And as you're going to hear in this episode, the ripple effects of the Dobbs decision have the power to affect everyone's access to family planning. There are ripple effects on our already strained healthcare system that have the power to compromise care for everyone. And there are ripple effects in terms of exacerbating economic and racial inequality, which also touches all of our lives. So today, I'm exploring just how far these impacts extend with my brilliant and hardworking guests, Dr. Pooja Lakshmin and Shefali Luthra. Dr. Pooja Lakshmin is a perinatal psychiatrist and author whose DC-based virtual private practice provides support to women suffering from postpartum depression and anxiety, along with others who are struggling with depression, anxiety, burnout, and identity loss. Her best-selling book, Real Self-Care, a transformative program for redefining wellness, was a 2023 NPR Best Book, and she's a regular writer for the New York Times. Shefali Luthra is a health policy reporter for the nonprofit news organization, The 19th. Her experience covering the intersection of gender and healthcare has culminated in her new book, Undue Burden: Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America. In it, Shefali highlights the life-threatening physical, mental, and emotional consequences of this loss of bodily autonomy. Shefali, Dr. Pooja, and I move between the macro level of talking about policy and the micro level of talking about people's lives as we discuss how abortion bans across the U.S. affect everyone, not just people who can get pregnant, and not only in states with bans in place. The all too real and lifelong mental and physical impacts of these gender-biased laws cannot be overstated. We explore what turned the right to choose into a political topic in the first place, and how framing a universal issue in this way has affected how we conduct conversations about it. I am so thankful that Dr. Pooja and Shefali joined me for this conversation. This is a hard conversation, and I firmly believe it is a necessary conversation and an urgent conversation. I hope this episode provides you with tools that you can bring into your conversations with the people that you love and care about. Shefali and Dr. Pooja, thank you so much for joining me today on Reimagining Love.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm so excited to be here.
You know, I was just saying before we started recording that there was a part of me that thought about taking out the Reimagining Love question because our topic is so big and so heartbreaking and so rage inducing that I thought we just have to get right into it and do the hard stuff. But I think it's even that much more important that we take a moment and really honor how each of you are coming into the space and who each of you are in this really hard space. So I would love for each of you to take a little moment and answer this question, which is, how are you reimagining love in one of your important relationships?
I can go first.
This is Dr. Pooja first. You'll learn both of their voices.
Yes. I don't know if this is totally reimagining, but I think I'm reflecting on love in relation to my son, who just turned 2 last week. And I'm thinking about, just kind of the joys of getting to watch him become a person in the world and how to show him love. And, as a perinatal psychiatrist, so much of my work with patients and then also with my writing is to talk about the ways in which motherhood can be deeply difficult and the ways in which our society and culture structurally has not set mothers up to succeed. And yet in my personal life, I'm really experiencing so much joy in motherhood.
How beautiful that in this season of your life, you are being fully reminded of the whole picture of motherhood, not just the parts that are difficult that you are guiding people through every day, but also the really lovely parts of it.
Yeah. And that, like you talk about, Alexandra, like that they coexist. Both are true. Both are part of it.
Yeah. Shefali, how about for you?
When you asked this question, I thought about getting married last year, which was very exciting. And it was a moment where I reflected a lot on my relationship with my spouse and how we think about love and how we approach it as a practice. And something I've been thinking about a lot that I hadn't put into words before was the idea that demonstrating love is an act of deliberate choice. And it's not necessarily something that happens to us or that we fall into, although attraction is a thing that exists, but that you wake up every day choosing to open yourself to a different person and to be open to them as well, and to meet each other in moments of vulnerability, in moments of highs and intense stress, and moments of lows and moments of joy, and choosing together to be for someone, which I think is a way that I want to define and approach love in all relationships, but it's something that I think is obviously very important in a romantic commitment.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of a line in Neil Donald Walsh wrote these books that are all about, they're called Conversations with God. And he has a whole series and he has this like kind of guiding question of like, what would love do? Like that in that moment, we have a choice of what would love do? And that's what you're speaking to, is that you're really aware of like what choosing love looks like in a moment by moment, action oriented way.
Exactly. It's not passive. It is an active thing that we do.
Good. So having the two of you together on the show is really, I'm so glad that you both said yes to this. And I want to just kind of set us up a little bit before we dive into this really difficult topic of what does it mean for us to be living and loving in a post-Roe America. And first of all, shout out to all of our international Reimagining Love listeners who are going to just be kind of bearing witness to this conversation, but this is definitely a capturing of what's happening in the US in this moment. So Shefali, in your new book, which is called Undue Burden, Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America, you're investigating the consequences of the Dobbs decision by sharing real life stories of people all around the country and stories that are perhaps the most tender and personal moments of these people's lives. And Dr. Pooja, you're, as you mentioned, a psychiatrist specializing in maternal mental health conditions, women's sexual wellness. And your fantastic book came out a little while ago, 2023, and it's called Real Self-Care, a Transformative Program for Redefining Wellness. So having both of you here is a chance to dive in to women's mental health, family planning, dating, relationships, and like where the hell we're going to go from here. So Shefali, first question to you is going to be what a central tenet of your book is that abortion access affects everyone, not just those who are pregnant. Can you tell us how? How is that?
I think this was something that really struck me as I reported this book, which, as you mentioned, I talked to more than I can count of healthcare providers, of activists, of patients, of people who really inhabit the abortion care landscape. And abortion is part of pregnancy-related healthcare. It is part of reproductive healthcare at large. And what we have seen happen in the past couple of years since Roe v. Wade was overturned is that the efforts to ban abortion have put strains on the healthcare system at large, and in particular, the healthcare system as it cares for people who are pregnant. The health centers that provide abortion, the physicians who provide abortion, often provide a host of other services, whether that is contraceptive care, STI screening, miscarriage care, pap smears, colposcopies, and all of these have been affected. I think a lot about a physician I spoke with in Arizona, a state where abortion has, for the most part, been legal, although there are restrictions there, but it's not on the same level as, say, Texas or Oklahoma. And so she saw many people coming to her from out of state for abortions. And as a result, she only had time to do abortions. She could not perform the other healthcare services on which people relied on her. And that's really powerful because it shows us that you don't necessarily need an abortion to see your access to healthcare at large constrained by the loss of abortion rights in another state. It's something that is just too meaningful. It affects too many people in our healthcare system, especially when it comes to one that cares for people who can get pregnant. It's just not well resourced enough and not supported enough to be able to withstand this intense blow without seeing this kind of repercussion across the board.
Dr. Pooja, are you feeling the impact in your practice and in the people that you are interfacing with?
Yeah. And Shefali, thank you for that really wonderful kind of description of how abortion impacts everyone, because I think that a lot of times when folks are having this conversation, it's often just women, or birthing people when really this is something that affects everyone. So my clinical practice is still based in Washington, D.C. So though I live in Texas, I practice telemedicine. So my patients are in Washington, D.C., where they still have pretty robust access to abortion care if needed and reproductive care. But like you mentioned, Shefali, Texas is a place where pretty much we don't have that access. And so what I see with my patients is just a lot of fear and paranoia and legitimate paranoia, because I think we all kind of understand at this point that this isn't a red state, blue state thing. This is really, if these measures are taken to where lawmakers want them to go, where a group of lawmakers want them to go, this would impact everybody federally. And then from a personal standpoint, I became a mom later in life. I had my son when I was 38 and a half. And so I conceived via IVF. And I actually wrote about this for the New York Times, kind of talking about ambivalence in motherhood and how ambivalence is a normal part of the life cycle. And so if I were to have another baby, I would be having a baby in Texas, which is terrifying. And that's the other thing that this brings up is our access to family planning and fertility, reproductive assisted technology in order to grow the family you want, which absolutely will impact everybody.
Not to mention, to your point, I mean, IVF is absolutely part of this conversation. It's something that the anti-abortion movement, given its natural endpoint, would want to restrict because of how it uses embryos. And then even if you don't ever intend to get an abortion, never will need one, never will miscarry, which again, these are both very common things. So there's no way to know that you will never need this healthcare service. The loss of IVF is something that could also really shape your ability to have a family when and how you want to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we saw it happen already in Alabama in terms of IVF, which really has, women are really scared.
Yes, understandably, legitimately. It's not paranoia, right? It is not something that is being pulled out of thin air.
Yes. It's funny. After I said paranoia, I was like, that's not the right word, because it's not a bizarre paranoia. It's a very realistic paranoia.
Right. One of the things that Shefali says at the very end of her book, Shefali, you write that the bans and barriers they face in accessing care have given them the same message. The country they live in does not trust them to make their own decisions about their lives. They are less of a person than someone who could not get pregnant. Many of them believe that America does not care if they live or die. After hearing their stories, I cannot blame them. That's not paranoia.
It's not at all. And every now and then, when you spend as much time in this, as I have, as reporters have, as you have, I'm sure, Dr. Pooja, as a clinician standpoint, like it's very easy to just think about this as something that is happening, that is the world that we live in. And then you take a moment and you step back and you remember that people are being asked for government approval for their healthcare simply because it is reproductive healthcare in a way that they would not have to for anything else, and in a way that is very explicitly tied to gender. And when you think about that and remind yourself of that framing, and then hear from all these people who have had to live that, have not been able to understand intellectually, why do I need to leave my state or to circumvent my state span? Why are they not allowing me to have this thing that is medically and psychologically and financially and whatever else right for me? It's just pretty shocking to put it in that context and realize that's the world we live in.
Okay, so Dr. Pooja, in your book, you explore the difference between what you call faux self-care and what you call real self-care. And so with the fall of Roe, it seems to me that it is more critical than ever that we understand this distinction that you spell out so beautifully. And, that's because of two of the arguments that you make in your book. One, we are in greater need of real self-care during times of systemic failure and collective trauma, ergo life in post-Roe America. And two, when we are stressed out, burned out, when we're facing mental health challenges, we are even more vulnerable to the allure of faux self-care. So what is the difference between real self-care and faux self-care?
So, the subtitle of my book is Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included, which is a little bit, kind of tongue in cheek, but it is pointing to how the fact that, the wellness industry is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and it is primarily targeted at women. And we live in this world where you're told that, just kind of there, take a bubble bath, have a glass of wine, it's going to be fine. You're overreacting. When in reality, what we're seeing is women's rights being eroded, every day. And so when I'm talking about faux self-care, I'm talking about, the bubble baths, the juice cleanses, even the yoga and the meditation. And before anybody kind of comes at me, it's not that those things are bad, because they can be, there is evidence for yoga and meditation as helpful for mild depression and anxiety. But what I'm saying is that those are methods. Faux self-care is a method, and a method is something that is circumscribed that you can use for a very specific problem, whereas real self-care consists of principles. And I go through 4 principles in the book: boundaries, compassion, values, and power. And a value is something that you make your own. A value is something that you can apply consistently over time. And that's not something that you can buy. That's something that, like, as we were talking about love, it's something you practice. It's not something you ever check off of a to-do list, like I went to yoga. No, you're learning your boundaries through every single stage and change and season of your life. And I think that this is a really important thing to kind of frame in this conversation, because, as many of your listeners probably know, Audre Lorde and bell hooks were the ones that really kind of put self-care and self-preservation on the map. And that comes from, Black queer social justice advocates and activists. And what I'm kind of saying, and what theirs have been saying, is that in order to actually change these systems, that women and marginalized folks, anybody who's kind of other in the eyes of the systems of power, we need to recognize that the problem is not in us. The problem actually lies in the system, and we need to be strong enough. We need to buffer ourselves to be able to fight and see that it's not our fault.
Yeah. Shefali, as I was reading your book, I thought a lot about your self-care as you worked on this project, because you move between the macro systemic. I mean, it is a history. It is a month-by-month historical record that you really have created and offered us, as well as, you move into the intimate lives of so many people who have faced the need for abortion, who have found themselves with an unintended pregnancy or a non-viable pregnancy, or, all of these different stories. What does self-care look like for you as you were working on this project?
I am so excited to answer this question, but also very curious to hear, particularly from you, Dr. Pooja, about what you make of this, because this was a tough reporting process. I am 32 years old, and I am of reproductive age. I live in a city where abortion is protected. But at the same time, when I met these people and learned about their stories and their experiences, I saw myself, and I understood that had I been born somewhere else, had some different circumstance of life been different, what happened to them could have happened to me. which is what I hope readers take out of this book as well, that there is a real universality of impact and that so many of us could be in these situations. But bearing witness to that and hearing that and feeling that over and over again is very psychologically difficult. And what I did in terms of, I'm thinking about as sort of like proximate self-care, is I tried to build distance when I could and to pull myself out of that reporting when possible. I actually do a lot of yoga. I do run a lot. And I understand that those are not the things that will, they're not going to change what we see and what we experience and what we understand. But for me, they were moments of separation and an ability to reassert some kind of control over something small in the world, even if that does not mean the ability to change things that have happened to people. And the other thing that I thought about a lot in this book, which is it became sort of a talisman to come back to, was the idea that the people I met in reporting this book went through experiences that for many of them were very, very difficult, not because abortion in itself is, like a horrible thing. It's not. It is a healthcare procedure. But the circumstances under which people get abortion are so fraught, are so stigmatized, are so legally vulnerable, financially tenuous, that for many of them, this was something they had never told anyone. It was one of the worst experiences of their lives, one of the scariest things they went through, because they didn't know if they would ever regain the money they spent on it, if they were putting themselves at legal risk. Many of them, did not ever expect to have an abortion. And then their lives kept going. And I met them in moments of intense vulnerability and often trauma. And as I stayed in touch with them over time, they showed remarkable resilience and they kept going. And there's a woman in the book named Angela who spends a lot of money trying to get her abortion, does not tell anyone about it other than her then boyfriend, because she is so afraid of what people will say. And at the end of the book, she and her young son and the boyfriend, now fiance, are doing a lot better. He has gotten a job. She is also working. He is back in school. She is hoping to enroll in school again soon and become maybe a nurse. They've moved into a bigger home. They actually have a bedroom for their kid already because they didn't have that before. And it reminded me that, especially in my line of work, we meet people very often at incredible lows, but they contain so much more than that. They are, in fact, people whose lives are cyclical and they have ups and downs. And if you can remind yourself that the thing that you are seeing, this thing for someone that is very, very difficult, is not the end of their story and that their stories keep going, I found that very powerful and a helpful idea to latch onto in moments when I found this reporting very difficult to pursue.
To me, what it sounds like, Shefali, is that you recognized the despair that this very important work could cause for you, because you're human and you are somebody who's empathetic and compassionate. So, of course, you would feel this way. And you were intentional with wanting to create distance. And that was yoga, that was running, that was these specific methods. And it's funny because, we didn't plan this. This is totally spontaneous, but I think that is a very nice example of real self-care, because in you giving yourself those boundaries, in you giving yourself compassion, and you just kind of naming some values of how you went into this work, the stance you took in the interviews you were doing and as you were engaging in this really high level of reporting, that's real self-care. And the power piece is that because you took care of yourself in a real way, in a reflective way, an intentional way, you put this book out into the world, which is going to change the lives of is already changing the lives of so many people. And that, at its highest form, is my hypothesis with real self-care, that each of us personally can exert our own agency to make changes in the spaces that are available to us. And when we all put that together, that's how change happens.
That's really great to hear. I'm so happy that I did a good job doing self-care.
That's right. That's right. I want to talk a little bit about the people who love and are near the people who are facing abortion, the relationships that people are in. Because Shefali, you told the story of a woman who was so alone, was going through this alone, didn't tell anybody, didn't reach for support. And that is obviously I think you teased out that really important distinction, that it is not abortion in and of itself that is traumatizing or that is inherently difficult. It is the shame, it is the aloneness, it is the overwhelm, it is the feeling like you are up against an entire legal system or financial hurdles. It is that part of it. So I wonder if we could spend some time just talking about, how to be near somebody who's facing this. And you were one of the statistics that you share is that 21 states have abortion bans in effect with only very limited exceptions. And one of the limited exceptions is about these 6-week bans that have taken effect in 12 states at this moment in time. And that the 6 weeks eliminates any room for contemplation, for decision-making, for conversation, for ambivalence, to use Dr. Pooja's word from a bit ago. You basically have to be sure of what you want the second that you hear this news, and you have to take immediate actions and have the funds available. What did you witness as the major decisions? Like, what are those major decisions that one needs to face at that moment? And how are people kind of gathering around a woman when she is facing that decision?
To your point about something like a 6-week ban in particular, it's exactly that. It leaves no room for conversation. And close to half of all pregnancies are unintended or unplanned. And what that means is when you find out you are pregnant and you have this very, very narrow window, you have to first decide the obvious question, can I be a parent right now? Or what is in fact more common is, can I be a parent to yet another child? Because most people who get abortions are already parents. And very often the reason they get an abortion is they know that they can't afford another kid. So they're thinking about, what would this mean for me financially? Can I afford to raise one more child? What would this mean for my ability to parent the person I am already parenting? How long ago did I give birth? What are my finances? What are the values I was raised in? Because different families talk about abortion differently. And then let's say, even with this very narrow window, you say, well, I think I need an abortion. I can't become a parent or become a parent to another. You then have to think about all of the next steps in logistics, which is, in a state like Texas, for instance, you, before the total ban there took effect, had to make 2 visits to a healthcare provider in person, separated by 24 hours. So you'd have to figure out, all right, which healthcare center am I going to? What are the soonest times they can see me for not 1 appointment, but 2 appointments? What money am I going to use to pay for this? Because very often abortion is not covered by health insurance. Do I have the means to wait until my next paycheck? Do I have to pay for this now, even though I just paid rent? Who will take care of my child while I am at this appointment? Do I have time to take off work? And the thing about abortion is that it is, by definition, an unplanned medical need. It's an unplanned medical expense. And at its cheapest, it is several $100s. And at its most expensive, it can be thousands. And so you have to figure out that this is, in fact, the right thing for you. And then in addition, the finances, the time off, the logistics, who will help you with all of your other family needs. And then how will you get there? Will you need someone to be there for support, someone to take you home, and all of that? It's so much, especially if you have a lower income, if you are, say, a minor, if you are traveling from far, it can functionally make this not a decision people have any time to actually act upon.
Dr. Pooja, what happens to our mental health then in the face of that kind of crunch and complexity?
So there was actually a study done at UCSF, kind of a notable study that was looking at, it's called the Turn Away study, aptly named for looking at the mental health impact when women are turned away, women that want an abortion are not able to get one. And unsurprisingly, the rates of depression and anxiety, the risk for depression and anxiety goes up in those women. Some studies saying even as high as 50% of women that want an abortion and are not able to get one. One of the things that I was thinking as we're having this conversation is, like, choice is being taken away. Agency is being taken away. And when you remove agency, that's when there's the feeling of powerlessness and despair too, right? Which are all kind of that hopelessness, that feeling there's nothing that you can do. Those are feelings that are commonly associated with depression as well. And the other piece of this that I'm thinking about is, I think it's almost 3 million women in the United States every year report being sexually assaulted. And about 10% of those sexual assaults might lead to a pregnancy or will lead to a pregnancy. Obviously, it's hard to study this, and many of those women are adolescents or young adults, right? So this is something that not only is impacting your mental health status at the time of the abortion and the years around it, but also it will impact your entire life. obviously bringing a child into this world and then how you're able to parent. It's sort of hard to overstate how impactful this taking away this type of healthcare is for a woman and a family as well.
Shefali, you make this point around just the highly gendered nature of this. That gender's become even more of a dividing line in American society, one that has amplified existing inequalities and created new ones. Gender now determines whether people have the right to make their own medical decisions.
And I think it is just so important that we be clear about this. And one of the ideas that the book spends some time on is the connection between restrictions on abortion and restrictions on other forms of gender-related healthcare. And I spend some time thinking about gender-affirming care in particular and how efforts to ban access to that kind of treatment for young people for now, but for likely more people in time, really reflects in many ways the legal and political strategy of the anti-abortion movement, and also comes from a similar point of view, which is that there is a way to express gender and sexuality that people do not want to be medically legitimate, even though there is no medical reason for these kinds of laws and bans. And what I find really interesting about looking at these together is that it shows us that there is a very clear pattern and we can be explicit about it. And it is that it is imposing these burdens and this not just sense of inequality, but in fact, true inequality upon people because of their gender. And that absolutely has implications for people's physical health, their psychological health, their financial well-being, their ability to advance in our economy, their ability to live a full and proper life. And all of those effects are really tremendous.
Just to also soapbox here a little bit about the choice thing too, is I think it's not just, right, like you're saying, Shefali, it's not just about the decision of whether or not to have a baby, but also future decisions when it comes to things like freezing your eggs when you're in your 20s or your 30s, or making an embryo with a partner and testing for certain genetic conditions if you know that that's something that's in your family history. The legislation that came down in Alabama more recently this year about embryonic personhood, that basically is another way that these people in power are wanting to rip away the options and the choices for young people, really. I was fortunate because of the choices that I was able to make. And of course, the privilege that I have to delay my ability to start a family as I pursued my career. But will women in their 20s and early 30s have that ongoing option? It's really scary to me. And I hope that folks listening kind of understand how this impacts not only themselves, but also their sisters, their daughters, their nieces, their grandchildren too.
I would like each of you to speak to how do we want men to be hearing this conversation, men and those who cannot get pregnant. When we're talking about helplessness, I'm also imagining, and I have seen firsthand, the helplessness of a male partner when a woman is up against this incredibly complicated matrix of constrictions and restraints and perhaps like closed doors and impossibilities. Like there's also a kind of helplessness then that sets in for the male partners. What do we want to be saying to male listeners and to men about this conversation, which has been, I think, conveniently and problematically framed as a women's issue?
Yeah, this is something I thought about so much, especially when first conceiving of this book and pitching it. And for me, it was very important that it be one that had an audience as well that was men. And that's in part because, it takes people of all genders to create pregnancy to begin with. And for all the people who I spoke to in this book, the ability to have your partner there with you can be a tremendous source of support. It can really matter in terms of feeling slightly less alone in a process that was already isolated from the medical system and is becoming even more so because of all of the secrecy conferred and spurred by abortion bans. Having someone being present with you, helping talk about this, helping you feel less alone is very critical. And we can also be aware that for something like miscarriage, which is, affected by abortion bans as well, and is treated by the same medication as abortion, miscarriage can affect both people in a partnership, in a relationship, and leaving space for yourself as well to understand that the world order that we have entered, it has dramatic implications for you as well. and to think about it as you think about how you want to build your values for the society that we want to live in and how you want to engage as a political actor. If this is something that affects the people you love, if it's something that affects you, does that affect your politics, and should it?
I agree with everything that you're saying, Shefali. And, for the folks that are listening that are not, able to get pregnant themselves, I'm glad. Thank you. First step. Like, thank you for listening to this episode and not, giving it a pass, but actually saying it's important for me to be here. I think that there's the kind of ability to be the support person in the time of need during the actual physical abortion or the miscarriage or, whatever the kind of event is. And then I also think that the ability to converse around this topic, even when it doesn't directly impact you currently, is hugely important for men and other partners or support people. If you have somebody in your life who is impacted, that is going through infertility or that has had a pregnancy that was unwanted or unplanned, to be able to show up and engage and just offer a lending ear goes a long way. Because, like, as we've been talking about, so much of this is shrouded in the best of times. This is shrouded in secrecy and loneliness. And if you can be willing to ask questions, ask how that person feels, ask, how can I help? Is there anything that I can do? I know I'll never be able to completely understand, but I would like to find a way to be here for you. And then if this person is actually your partner, being willing to be there for the conversations that may come up around family planning or, deciding where you want to live or where you might take a new job or how you want to raise your family, all of these types of things. I think, based on what we're seeing in America in 2024, I think that those types of conversations need to be coming up in just sort of life planning or something like being close to family or not being close to family. I do think I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder in that I think, living in Texas, people that live in states that do not have access to abortion and reproductive care at that level, we can't just all pick up and move and leave. Like, people have families, people have, and we need healthcare providers in these states. But if you are in a position where you are making these choices, and if you're a partner, don't tell your partner that it's ridiculous for her to be worried about this, or don't say something like, oh no, it'll be fine, don't worry. Like, showing your appropriate concern and being there is a huge source of validation and support.
It's making me think about how men's isolation from this entire topic of reproductive health care begins when men are little boys, right? When the boys and the girls are separated for the conversations about menstruation and period, and female bodies and female reproductive systems. Like, it feels like it starts very early, that this feels like it is not anything I have to worry about, not anything I should worry about. It is secretive. It is other. Like, it's like those are the initial seeds that then become this kind of mass silence. Like, I'm actually confused by men's silence on this topic because because it is. I mean, there are men, for as many women as who are carrying these stories, as Shefali was talking about, like these stories of this kind of, difficult time, and then the recovery and, God willing, recovery and integration. There are men, male partners, brothers, fathers, uncles, grandpas, who have also been alongside women. So I don't understand. I'm kind of confused by, like, where is the collective male voice in this conversation?
There are voices out there. I'm thinking of some politicians who are men who have talked about what abortion has meant to their families, who have talked about it as an important issue. But I mean, you're absolutely right that in our discourse, it is an area where there has been an argument implicitly and sometimes explicitly that women should be at the center of these conversations. And that's very complicated because, at the one hand, you can say most people who get abortions are women. I want to be careful to acknowledge that trans and non-binary people get abortions as well. But you could also say that, you should center expertise and lived experience, but also this should not be siloed. It should not be cast as something that you can only talk about if you have a uterus. That this is simply not accurate or productive in terms of our politics and our collective understanding. And I'm thinking about your point about the idea that we are segregated at such a young age when we learn about menstruation. And in a way, that's especially shocking now because menstrual cycles and pregnancy dating, they inform public policy. I mean, we have lawmakers who legitimately don't understand how pregnancies are dated because they don't know how a menstrual cycle works. And as a result, don't know what a 6-week abortion ban means. And that is the kind of thing that could be undercut if we treated this as something that everyone should know about, that should be taught to people regardless of their gender, because it's simply biology and it matters to all of us.
Pooja, what are you seeing in terms of the impact on women who are dating, who are looking for partnership? Like, how are you finding that this post-Roe reality is impacting how women are dating and partnering?
Yeah, I think that it's something that really is top of mind in terms of the navigation of who you want to be dating, how you want to date, if you want to date, sort of using this, what's happening with reproductive rights being eroded, using that as kind of a tool, a conversation tool to see how a potential partner responds, because you do get so much data from bringing this up with a person when you're dating. And what I feel like I see from kind of like the Gen Z crowd is that, talk about it early, know right away. And that it's kind of a deal breaker. It is a deal breaker in a lot of circles to not have somebody who's on the same page with you. There's a lot more awareness now about kind of birth control and sort of the options that are there for birth control. And I think kind of a healthy fear of what is to come, even regarding birth control and things like the morning after pill. So I see like young people taking this seriously and wanting to fight to get their rights back, but also to make sure that the people that they're choosing to partner with are aligned with them as well.
This is something that came up less in my reporting in terms of the choices people made in terms of partnership. And perhaps it was because Dobbs was still so fresh at that point, and many of them were figuring out what this meant. And many of them simply didn't think they would ever need an abortion because they were like, well, I use birth control, I won't get pregnant, even though birth control is very effective, but not 100%. But one thing that has stayed with me is thinking about so many people in the book who did not feel like they could trust their romantic partners with this decision. There was one young woman who was pretty sure that when she told him that she was going to get an abortion, he blocked her number. That's a scary situation to be in when this is something that the two of you came into together, but that at the end of the day, you are alone in, and that you don't have that support network for. It is something that people don't think about in their relationships and how they want to approach it. It's certainly not a bad idea for it to be something that they consider, just given how meaningful something like pregnancy and choosing whether or not to stay pregnant can be in terms of how it shapes a relationship.
I think it's another way that it's highly problematic to frame this as a quote unquote political issue, because part of what's happened over many years is that political, leanings and privilege have been so entwined that it sort of feels like your political leaning is just, it's very personal. It's very much just your own political leaning, and nobody else should be able to judge you for it or make choices about you based on it. And we're not in that world now. And so when you're both speaking to the need for women, for those who could become pregnant, to be actively screening potential partners around this reality, like that is not about political leanings or preferences. It is about a very much boots on the ground. Like, what the hell would you do if this happened? Like, would you be there for me? It's not a kind of privilege, take it or leave it. Where would you stand? It is about what would this look like in terms of our lives?
And again, at the same time, it's understandable why that's a difficult conversation for people to even think about having, because like people don't wake up thinking, oh, someday I will have an unintended pregnancy and get an abortion. It is so common, and yet it is not something that people for the most part think will happen to them until it does.
I think from what I've seen with what happened in Alabama and the embryo personhood decision, I feel like that kind of broke through a little bit, kind of broke through the noise to open up the conversation about, oh, this isn't just the idea that I have in my mind of who gets an abortion or what getting an abortion means, but there are wider applications here. But I do agree that it's because it's something that has been so shrouded in secrecy and silence, and there's been so much historically, there's been shame around it, then it's harder for people to recognize that it's actually important for them to think about.
Yeah. Before we talk about kind of where we go from here, Shefali, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about how, even though we could see this coming, like you write about how in some ways we could see it coming in the very immediate and that there was the leak of the Dobbs decision, but also we could see it coming in terms of 50 years of various kinds of efforts to chip away at or undermine the protections of Roe, that still you feel like we as a country were caught unawares. Like, what does that say about kind of the state of our healthcare, that we were so ill prepared for the impact of this?
This is something I have thought about a lot, and I've come down to two answers that I think help illustrate why was it that it was clear, if you were paying attention, that Roe had been under attack for a very long time, that Texas's 6-week abortion ban was upheld in September of 2021, that the Supreme Court heard the Dobbs oral arguments and was very skeptical that Roe should be upheld, that Dobbs was in fact leaked, and then 6 weeks later, the decision was almost word for word the same. And the response from lawmakers was, we need more time to figure out what's next. Why did that happen? And the two things that I think about are in part that one thing that we've all sort of alluded to in this conversation is that abortion rights existed in theory and in practice in the lead up to Dobbs, but they had been chipped away at in many states like Texas, like Mississippi, like Missouri, where there were fewer and fewer clinics because of other laws that states had affected, making it harder to provide care. Laws that were not grounded in medical reality, but simply were meant to deter clinicians from offering abortions. But the people who write about politics, who influence our political discourse, and lawmakers themselves, for the most part, were insulated from that. They are represented on the coasts. Journalists are most often living in DC, New York, and LA, all places that had not seen this dramatic reduction in abortion over time. Lawmakers are centered in DC, where abortion is protected. And so it's easier to be in these, smaller points of our country and not see what is going on and not internalize that it does in fact mean that abortion will be eliminated as a constitutional right relatively soon. And I think that media concentration in a few cities and discourse concentration and lawmaker concentration really did affect how people thought about this and how seriously they took this. And that's something that could have been prevented. But the other thing that I do think is worth noting is in some ways this shocked people and they were not prepared for it because we did experience something very radical. There has never been a Supreme Court overturn of a right that we had for almost 50 years. And so, in some ways, of course, people were shocked when it happened because it hadn't happened before. And you can see all these signs that are coming, but then you have to believe it. And I think many people just simply were not able to believe it because, like, how could something like this happen? It's never happened before. And for a lot of people, it felt like a really dramatic departure from how constitutional law is typically performed. It was just really, really, it was shocking.
Where I want to spend a little time on where do we go from here? So we've been shocked. This has happened. In some ways, maybe it's hard to talk about where we go from here because, to your second point, like it was such a reversal of what the Supreme Court has done before. And so it's like, oh my God, well, what the hell is the next thing we're going to be dealing with? But what are some of the touchstones that we know right now to both of you in terms of kind of where do we go from here in terms of our activism as well as our self-care?
On the front of how politics are practiced and how activism exists within that, the overturn of Roe has changed American politics. Like, we have elections that Democrats were expected to lose, the 2022 midterms, in which they overperformed, in large part because of voter anger over abortion bans and the overturn of Roe. Abortion has been on the ballot time and time again in states of different politics around the country, conservative states and liberal states, as a standalone measure. Would you want your state to protect abortion rights or something to that effect? And abortion wins every time. And people are very energized around this. And these measures are very expensive. They are campaigns not available in every state. Texas does not have a citizen ballot measure, but they illustrate that this is something voters really care about. And their views of abortion have not changed. Voters always supported Roe by the most part, but how much they prioritize it has changed. And there is a real opening to reconsider how much can your influence matter? How much can you change how our country talks about abortion? are our elections going to look different? Will people vote for a country and a society and a democracy that treats this as a right that matters? And if so, what does it take for that kind of narrative shift to happen? And how do you have to consider how you fit into the story and how abortion fits into your own story? I think all of those pieces are interrelated.
I think the number one thing when it comes to activism is that we need people to vote in November. We need people to vote. We need people to bring their friends to the polling place. We need people talking on their text threads. Like, we need just to keep this at the forefront of everyone's mind over the next 4 to 5 months, so that people remember that this election is hugely, hugely going to be hugely, hugely impactful. Because if we don't do that, then there's a very high likelihood that this right will not exist for people, even in blue states, and that things will get even worse. And I know that that sounds like a little bit doomsday-y, but I genuinely do think that that is the reality. We just need everybody to vote. And then I would say, from a self-care standpoint, again, kind of coming back to Shefali's own self-care share about when you were writing the book, I think that's just such a nice example of, if you are somebody who is an advocate, if you are somebody who's an activist, if you're somebody who is the person that is initiating these conversations, understand that that's labor, that's emotional labor. It can be exhausting work, and you need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and you're understanding and internalizing the fact that each time you bring this topic up at a dinner party, each time you ask a random mom at the park about this and feel awkward, but do it anyway, that is an act of exerting resistance and engaging with power. And that will require care on your part. So to be gentle with yourself.
Both of you, so well said. I mean, I think that I'm biased here, but I don't understand how we can be anything but single issue voters on this matter because of the points that you both have made around how this affects every single one of our lives defined broadly in terms of the lives of ourselves and our neighbors and our loved ones and our friends and our coworkers and our partners, and our family members. So Shefali, I think that I know you would agree, and you maybe want to add to this. It is not an exaggeration to say that we are very much on the precipice, right, of talking about this. I think for those of us who've taken comfort in, I live in a blue state or I live near a blue state, that is something that we will very realistically lose, right, depending on how November goes. Is that right, Shefali? Is that what you're also seeing?
Absolutely. It is very clear that even if Donald Trump, who is the Republican, presumptive nominee, does not say he would support a national abortion ban, it is something that the people he allies himself with do support. And it is something that is clearly on the table as they think about what they want next. Even if there is a step-by-step approach to getting there, it is their natural endpoint. And it is something that will become much more likely, and national restrictions will become much more likely if he is elected and is able to install those people in positions of executive power. It's not at all dramatic to say that this is something that could have very meaningful implications for people in every state around the country. And I mean, thinking about the way in which people vote is so tricky because single issue voters don't exist, right? People vote for all sorts of reasons and they group them and they prioritize them, but they vote on the economy and they also vote on climate or on racial justice or on their neighborhoods or on healthcare or on abortion. What I think is that in time, more conversations like this one can help with a shift that is already starting, which is people understanding more that abortion deserves to be part of that and deserves to be not a sideline, something that, in fact, if you are thinking about what country reflects your values and what world you want to live in, is something where you do have the power to ask for a candidate and a lawmaker and politician who is with you on that. That is a choice that you have.
Yeah. Thank you both for a really difficult, really comprehensive, really important conversation. I want to make sure that people know about how to connect with both of you in an ongoing way and to keep learning from you because your voices are so important right now and will be going forward. So Shefali, how about for you first? How can people connect with you and get to know more about what you're doing?
I post very infrequently on the site formerly known as Twitter. My handle there is Shefali L, but I am quite responsive on email. And you can reach me there at sbluthra@19thnews.org. The 19th is the nonprofit newsroom where I work.
Wonderful. And we're going to have links to your fantastic new book, Undue Burden, Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America, in the show notes. And that book is available wherever you get your books.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Pooja, how about you?
So I'm Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. My website is poojalakshmin.com. I also write a Substack newsletter that comes out weekly-ish. It's poojalakshmin.substack.com. I'm probably most active on Instagram. I'm Pooja Lakshmin there. And my book, Real Self-Care, is available in all the places that you can get books. There's also an audiobook that I narrate that you can listen to if you like the sound of my voice.
Thank you both. Keep fighting, and we'll keep fighting. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja and Shefali, for joining me on Reimagining Love. I hope this conversation highlighted why the widespread discussion around reproductive rights is so essential as we continue advocating for positive change. In the show notes, you're going to find links to Shefali and her work and her new book, Undue Burden, Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America, and links to Dr. Pooja Lakshmin and her book, Real Self-Care, a transformative program for redefining wellness. Until next time, be well. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening, and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.